For those of you who are joining us online, this is an Egmont Royal Institute for International Relations seminar, a book presentation. My name is Nina Willen. I'm the director of the Africa program at the Egmont Institute. And today I have the honor of hosting Professor Miles Tendy, who is teaching politics at the University of Oxford's Department of Politics and International Relations at the African Studies Center. And Miles, he has published a book. It's very recent. It's almost fresh off the press, 2 months ago. That's called The Overthrow of Robert Mugabe, Gender, Coup, and Diplomats. And I'm not going to go into details about the book because I'm going to let Miles present it. But we will do as we usually do with the Egmont seminars and Africa seminars in particular, that I will let Miles present the book for about 30 minutes or so, the time that you would like to take, and then we will open up for questions and a discussion about the book and the themes that you are highlighting in the book. So without further ado, I'll leave the floor to you, Miles.
Thank you, Nina, for that kind introduction. Very kind. Well, this is the book, if you can all see it. It's about the 2017 coup that removed Zimbabwe's Robert Mugabe from power. I am going to start by saying a few things about the book's contributions. And then I will try to delve a bit more deeply into the international dimensions of this particular coup. Since this is the Egmont Institute, I thought that angle of the book might be of greater interest to you than the nitty-gritty details of the actual coup in Zimbabwe. But I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. So let me just start with the contributions very briefly. I should say one of the big points, the book is trying to underline is that gender is the stuff of coups. Political science scholarship about coups generally ignores gender to its detriment. It's arguing that. It's trying to point out that if we grasp the workings of gender in politics, of women in coup situations, we understand the nature of coups with more rigor and more accuracy. So the chapters in the book show the criticality of gender and women's politics in Zimbabwe's 2017 coup, but beyond that, in coups elsewhere as well. Coups everywhere are infused with gendered politics in respect of their causes, dynamics, and rationalizations. Gender also has an important imprint on the diplomacy and international politics of coups, as well as on how coups are written about by some scholars who reproduce patriarchal biases and sexist tropes found in society. So that's one of the main contributions of the book, trying to center gender and women's politics in the way we think and write about coups. Another second thing that it really tries to contribute is this debate about whether coups are changing. Using several historical examples, the book tries to debunk arguments that try to make the point that Zimbabwe's 2017 coup was somehow different from past coups. It was described at the time as emblematic of a new type of coup, one which is indefinite, mutable, and one which exhibits citizens' involvement, amongst other debatable modern attributes. On the other hand, my book is trying to say, actually, this coup looked a lot like old-style coups we'd seen on the continent before. So it's trying to best contextualize, historicize this coup, and also underlining the fact that here, the rich and instructive histories of coups in Africa, the continent that has witnessed the most amount of coups historically in the world, tends to be ignored. That actually, if we dive deep into the histories of these coups, the nature of them, we find that a lot of the coups we think of in the present as somehow unique, unusual, or shifting, have actually been seen before on the continent. And Zimbabwe is a good case example of that. So that's another thing the book tries to do, to actually show that across time, much of the way that coups works has relatively remained stable, so to speak. The third thing it tries to contribute is really about the coup itself. So coups are best understood case by case. So the book really dives into the coup in this context and teases out very carefully the causes of this particular coup and the catalyst for the coup. As we know, coups look differently in every place. They're very context specific. The mix of motives varies, so it sets out the particular mix of motives for this coup in Zimbabwe in 2017. Then the fourth thing the book tries to do is to explain the responses of African, Western, and Chinese actors to the coup. The Zimbabwean coup was interesting in that all of these actors I've just talked about, the West, Africa, and China, saw these actors pretty much on the same boat, in the sense that nobody um, outrightly condemned this coup or even called it a coup proper in public. So the book is trying to explain that puzzle, why this seeming conspiracy of silence, if you will, by Western actors, African actors, Chinese actors, letting what is a coup pass and not condemning it, not calling it a coup, not taking any punitive measures. So the book tries to explain that puzzle as well. So I think it's in those four areas that the book tries to make contributions. But here I thought I would talk more about the response of Western actors, which is one element in the book. And to begin with, I think a good place to start would be to say a bit of history. So Western nations, and here I mean the EU and America, their engagement with Zimbabwe since 1980 had about three different phases. From 1980 to about 2000, relations were largely cordial, but they began to break down in 2000 when the ZANU-PF government launched a program of violent seizures of private-owned land by white commercial farmers in Zimbabwe. So Western nations publicly criticized the ZANU-PF government for staging rigged elections in 2000, in 2002, and 2005, June 2008, and 2013. Although more violent elections had been seen in Zimbabwe in the 1980s, and rigged elections had also occurred in Zimbabwe in the 1990s, but these had encountered little Western criticism. America and the EU applied sanctions on the ZANU-PF government. They cut off direct aid to the Zimbabwe government and attempted to isolate Zimbabwe. Relations between the West and the ZANU-PF government remained strained, even though the Western sanctions regime was weakening until about the time of the 2017 coup. Western states such as the US and the EU all seem to believe that the coup that happened in 2017 was a potential opening for some kind of democratic transition and some kind of arrival of the long-awaited economic reforms Zimbabwe needed to place it back on a sure economic path, and also the possibility of a restoration of cordial relations with the West. So the 2017 coup was seen as an opportunity for this. So Western states did not call what was a coup and desisted from publicly condemning the military's actions. What's interesting here is that this stance was largely inconsistent with Western responses to coups elsewhere at the time. Since the Cold War, Western states had become less tolerant of coups in Africa and sought to promote elections and democracy. Before I proceed, let me clarify by saying how we should understand, or how I understand what a coup is. The general consensus among coup scholars that coups are illegal operations staged by the military in isolation or in league with civilian elites to remove an executive authority from power. In the case of Zimbabwe in 2017, Mugabe was ousted from power by the military, which deployed without presidential authority to effect a direct political intervention in politics that targeted him as a chief executive. In the book, I show that external actors, this case, for sake of our discussion, the West, circumvented the fact that the removal of Mugabe was in fact a coup. Notwithstanding the pertinence of anti-coup norms, democracy promotion in the world, Western states simply stuck to no public condemnation of the coup, and no punitive measures were applied. What I want to give you a bit now is a taste of why this was so, the reasons that motivated all this. I think the first port of call should start with Britain. I'm starting with Britain here because Britain is the former colonial power in the Zimbabwean context. And by virtue of its standing as the ex-colonial power in Zimbabwe, it exercised considerable influence on the inception and the maintenance of the isolationist approaches of the EU I talked about before. So I remember doing an interview with Simon MacDonald for the book. Simon MacDonald was the permanent undersecretary for the Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs and head of the diplomatic service when the Zimbabwean coup occurred. And he maintained that Britain had really determined EU relations with Zimbabwe for a long time, but that there was increasing disquiet among EU partners at the time that the coup occurred. There was a feeling in 2017 that the EU was behind the game now. By not being present on the ground, the EU was diminishing its influence in Zimbabwe. So the way he argued, the way Britain reacted to the coup was also pressure from the EU, which didn't believe so much in Mnangagwa as a reformer, but simply felt that the EU policy that had shaped its approaches to Zimbabwe for almost 2 decades just wasn't working. Let's try something different. Let's engage Mnangagwa. Mnangagwa is the politician. Emerson Mnangagwa was brought to power by the coup, and see whether he'll be different from Robert Mugabe. So Mugabe's opportunity got to be seen as some kind of opportunity to try something different, and that perhaps there were possibilities around democracy, possibilities around economic reform. So that's how he explained it. Calling the coup a coup in 2017 would have meant that the EU would have had to have applied the toughest sanctions ever, when it had already started reducing sanctions, I talked about before. So the EU was very much reluctant to turn back the clock. In many ways, it was tired of the standoff with Zimbabwe. One EU diplomat mentioned in the interviews. And there's a sense here in which Robert Mugabe was, in the end, a victim of his own success. What I mean by this is that Mugabe and ZANU-PF had successfully frustrated EU policy on Zimbabwe for 2 decades, to the extent that when Mugabe was actually removed from power, eventually unconstitutionally, the EU had reached a stage of ultimate exhaustion and frustration, in which it was willing to abstain from championing one of its most valued principles, the upholding of constitutional changes of government. So the EU's collective stance was not to endorse or support the coup, but to tolerate its occurrence by not publicly calling it a coup and giving the coup-born government the benefit of the doubt with regard to delivering a credible post-coup election, which implied notably an updated and reliable voter register and the presence of international electoral observers in the 2018 election. EU member states termed this approach strategic patience. In Britain itself, this may be the relationship with how things were determined with the EU, but in Britain itself, there was much division. When I say division here, I mean within the FCO. Rory Stewart was a British Africa minister at the time of the coup. And in interviews with him, he talked at length about how within the FCO, now the FCDO today, there was a lot of tension about how to respond to this coup, between those who knew a lot about Zimbabwe and had worked on it for years, and so had some kind of emotional investment in particular narratives about change after Mugabe, versus people like himself who knew very little about Zimbabwe, but based on their related experiences in the Middle East and Asia, were deeply skeptical about the possibilities of genuine change led by Mnangagwa and ZANU-PF. An example of a believer in change after Mugabe was the British ambassador to Zimbabwe from 2014 to 2018, Katrina Lane, who developed tangible links with Mnangagwa and his associates. The British ambassador calculated that Mnangagwa was best placed to replace Robert Mugabe or succeed Robert Mugabe as president, and that he would lead the implementation of reforms that would result in economic turnaround and re-establish cordial diplomatic and trade links with the West. Stewart, on the other hand, having seen similar transitions in the Middle East and Asia, was deeply skeptical of that. So you see division within Britain itself, its responses of the FCO. Turning to the US, the US ambassador at the time was Harry Thomas. His ambassador was about 2016 to 18. He recalled, again, long interviews with him as well, that when the coup occurred, a household member of staff at the US Embassy in Harare rolled on the floor repeatedly in front of him in sheer euphoria and relief upon the news that Mugabe had finally lost power in a coup. This personal experience, along with the multiple scenes of jubilation at Mugabe's loss of power by Zimbabweans in and outside the country, had a great effect on Thomas. So, for example, on 18 May 2017, many Zimbabweans marched in solidarity with the coup, demanding Mugabe resign the presidency. According to the US Ambassador Thomas, when these Zimbabweans marched past the US Embassy in Harare, the US Marines took a video of Zimbabweans marching and chanting USA, USA, USA. They were shocked by this. And when he saw the video, he talks about how he wept because it showed him that the people of Zimbabwe understood that the US had supported them and tried to support human rights and democracy in their country. So for him, there was this really emotional effect as well. The coup was a genuinely popular thing amongst many Zimbabweans, and the emotional effect was irresistible, making it difficult for Thomas to seek to undo a coup which appeared to wield such emotional pull, popular support, and perhaps the potential for political and economic reforms in Zimbabwe. But there are other things. It wasn't just this. Harry Thomas had considerable influence in determining the US government's response to the Zimbabwean coup, in large part because at the time the president was Donald Trump, who had little interest in Zimbabwe. When the coup happened, the Trump administration wanted to deploy American soldiers to Zimbabwe solely to protect American citizens in Victoria Falls, especially, which is where most Americans go on holiday. According to Thomas, I did not think Americans would be attacked in Victoria Falls, so I opposed sending troops. The safety of Americans is all that Washington, D.C. cared for. Washington, D.C. did not care about who was getting power and how. So amid this disinterest from the Trump administration, which reflected his wider disengagement from African affairs, Thomas really set the tone for America's response to the coup. If Thomas had publicly called the military's intervention a coup, then this would have resulted in the US cutting off aid to NGOs in Zimbabwe, and a waiver from Congress would be needed to resume aid. The largest part of US aid to Zimbabwe in 2017 was the US President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR. Thomas was very averse to PEPFAR being cut off in Zimbabwe because it was saving the lives of many ordinary Zimbabweans. Ceasing it would penalize needy citizens, regular citizens, not the well-heeled coup makers. On the whole, therefore, Thomas took the view that the US government did not have any real effective carrots or sticks in its toolbox to undo the coup in Zimbabwe. Hence, he actively and successfully ensured Washington, D.C. did not publicly denounce the intervention as a coup and apply any punitive measures. Thomas asserted that it is not right to be enough. If you're right but cannot persuade the people, i.e., the coup makers, to do the right thing, so what? So what? I was hoping the coup born government would be better, and they were promising us that they would be better. But of course, in the end, I was wrong. So the ways in which Western states were, for various reasons, unwilling to call Zimbabwe's 2017 coup a coup and respond appropriately to it, undermined their status as promoters of democracy and constitutionalism in Zimbabwe. I think that's an important takeaway. And here also we must remember that from the late 1990s, there was a rise of an anti-coup norm in Africa. What my book shows is Western diplomats really zero commitment to this anti-coup norm. And here I want to say that 10 months before Zimbabwe's 2017 coup, the scholar Oinsen Tansey published a paper called The Fading Anti-Coup Norm. Tansey warned in this paper, it was published in the Journal of Democracy, that the anti-coup norm remains limited in two important ways. Firstly, it is highly contingent geographically, embraced enthusiastically in some regions while almost completely ignored in others. Second, even where it has been embraced, it remains relatively shallow. International punishments can be weak and are often easily lifted, with coup leaders needing to do no more than take limited steps to restoring democracy. So it is this matter of a fading anti-coup norm that links Zimbabwe's 2017 coup to coups seen in subsequent years in Sudan, Chad, Burkina Faso, Mali, Guinea, Niger, and Gabon. In these latter coups, we see the anti-coup norm applied in some countries like Burkina Faso, but not others like Chad. We see firm application of the anti-coup norm in some countries like Niger, where a military intervention was even threatened if civilian authority was not restored, and that on the other hand, feeble application of the anti-coup norm in countries like Guinea. We see coup makers effectively postpone indefinitely a return to civilian rule in countries like Mali, while coup makers in countries such as Gabon have been able to organize relatively swift transitions that only civilianize and legitimize them as democratically elected politicians. So the anti-coup norm is very much in grave trouble. The Zimbabwean coup did not solely cause this grave trouble I speak of, but certainly was, you might want to say, was the precursor for much of the violations of the norm that we've seen during this last 5 or so years, where we've seen a resurgence of coups on the African continent. Okay, let me stop there, and maybe we can have some questions and fruitful discussions about all this. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Miles. For those of us who haven't read the whole book, I think your presentation really gives us an incitement to do so. For me, it's really interesting to hear both the parallels with the Sahel coup wave that I've been studying recently, and how it's very strategic the way that international actors react, whether they call it a coup or they don't call it a coup, or whether it is we've also had this discussion whether it's a good coup. Are there any good coups? And I guess that's going to be my first question to you, because I've had that question a few times. So my question is, are there any good coups? And then I also would like to ask you, and then I'm going to open it up for other questions. Of course, I also would like to ask you, you spoke about the US and the UK and the EU's reaction, but what about African leaders' reactions? How did they react? And what about other non-Western actors, like you talked in the beginning about China? What about their reaction? And before you answer, I would like to see if there is somebody else who have question. You can also, if you don't feel comfortable asking a question live, you can also write it in the chat box, and then I can read it out to Miles. But let's start with these two questions then, and then I have a lot of others as well.
Right. Let me start with the last one on the response of other actors. So I think with regards to, let me start with the African actors. The African Union is the key responder here. It's been the driver of the anti-coup norm. So analysts, scholars, we all look to see what the African Union would do. But here, this is where planning becomes quite important, or you might want to call it fortune as well. Planning in the sense that the generals in Zimbabwe who staged the coup calculated that they could influence key figures in the African Union. Fortune is that there was a general in Zimbabwe called Trust Mugabe, who had been appointed commander of the standby force and effectively advises the head of the AU Commission. He's an advisor on military affairs, peace, stability, and the sort. So his Zimbabwean in place was sympathetic to the coup makers. The planning then becomes that when we stage the coup, he must consistently message to the AU and the influential people in the AU that this wasn't a coup, it was something else. The euphemism became a military-assisted transition. So Mugabe, General Mugabe, Major General Mugabe, is doing a lot of this lobbying. What it does, on the other hand, though, is it he does sway certain figures in the AU, but not the AU president proper, who was Alpha Conde, who was also later ousted in a coup in Guinea. I think the way I explain it in the book is the history of coups in Guinea. During his time as well, his presidency, he had encountered attempted coups himself. And as I just mentioned before, he also loses power in a coup. So I think he was very alive to the threat of coups, to political status quos. So he actually comes out twice saying what's happening in Zimbabwe is a coup. One in an interview to Le Monde, and another, it was at a conference he was attending on the sidelines, and the journalist asking about. So he says that twice. But on the other hand, the AU Commission, because of this influence of Mugabe, is saying the opposite. So you have a divided response from the African Union. So the generals are able to divide the response at that level. But even then, we also know that the way the AU often works, even when it takes a stand against a coup, it still looks to the regional body to take the lead. So if the coup is in West Africa, it will still turn to ECOWAS to say, okay, ECOWAS, how do you're the body nearest the crisis on the ground, the practicalities, you see how to undo this coup. So ECOWAS, so the AU then turned to SADC, which was the regional body in Southern Africa. The challenge with SADC became this. The key player, the chairperson of SADC at the time, was Jacob Zuma. The coup happens in November 2017. In December 2017, Jacob Zuma is going to the ANC's national conference where his presidency is under threat from Cyril Ramaphosa. As we know, Zuma is actually pushed out soon after that conference. So when the coup happens in Zimbabwe, you have a very distracted SADC chairperson, worried about internal politics. His vice president Ramaphosa breathing down his neck, looking to push him out. So the coup is ongoing in Zimbabwe, and Zuma is completely not focused on that. His mind is on domestic politics. So it results in this really slow, feeble response on the part of South Africa. And because South Africa is this way, it's the SADC chairperson, there really isn't any traction. Then the individual at the time who was also part of influential in SADC at the time, who was most engaged with the crisis in Zimbabwe, was Ian Khama of Botswana, President of Botswana, who had a long-standing, I would even describe it as personal disagreement with Robert Mugabe at one level, but on another level, from very much about norms. Khama had been long critical about Mugabe's undemocratic practices, the violence in elections. So this is someone who had for a long time wanted to see Mugabe leave power, and Khama becomes a real stumbling block to any kind of response by SADC that would want to undo the coup. And then the most influential player, Jacob Zuma, is really taken up by domestic affairs. So in the end, you don't get an effective response from African states at all. And what looks like endorsement. So when you look at it on the outside, it looks like, oh, did Africa endorse this coup? It really isn't. It's about all these internal challenges that were playing out at the time, and the planning of the generals, the ability to divide views within the African Union. So that's how I would explain the African response. China, on the other hand, here I would want to link to what we find in the literature. China generally doesn't that coup response literature. When China's responses to coups in Africa have been studied, China generally doesn't believe in political engineering. So when coups occur, they're more likely to, okay, what is the outcome? Adjust to the new order, not attempt to reverse a coup, or even when a coup succeeds, to think that they can drive democratic change. That's not really how they look at foreign policy in relation to coup occurrence. So when the Zimbabwean coup happened, China simply adjusted. It's ZANU-PF, it's Mnangagwa who was coming in. How best can we further continue to secure our interests? And that was the response of the Chinese. They didn't push to try to reverse the coup, and they certainly didn't move to try to support it either. It was simply adjustment. So that's how I would explain the responses of China and Africa. Turning to a good coup. It's a great question. Look, we know the Niger coup in 2010, the one that removes Tanja, when Tanja is trying to stay on, I think, for a third term, and the military moves in to protect the constitution. And surprisingly, they organize a swift transition, a return to civilian rule. That could be deemed a good coup, the Niger coup of 2010. The Zimbabwean one certainly was. That's what shaped the responses of some Western actors, certainly. So it is in the air, this, and I think it's Othan, I hope that's how you say his name, Othan Varol, who wrote that book, The Democratic Coup. So the idea is there, it's been influential. You want to think historically, the coup in Portugal in 74, 75, the effect that it has in Portugal at that time, and also how the democratizing effect it has on Portuguese colonies and Angola, Mozambique, it precipitates independence there as well. So there are cases for that. But on the whole, I think this idea of a good coup, particularly democratic one, um, there is not enough evidence to suggest or support that coups can have this good effect. Largely the story of military rule, coup-born military rule in Africa has been one in which we've seen further economic decline, or economic decline has remained the same. Democracy doesn't improve. Personalization, further personalization of authority. When you think of, say, Jean Bedel Bokassa, the way he personalized rule in Central African Republic, Idi Amin as well. And also, if you think of Equatorial Guinea today under Obiang. So the evidence, overwhelmingly historical evidence, doesn't suggest that this idea of a good coup, yeah, has much weight to it. But it is an attractive idea. And I think one may want to ask why it's become attractive. And when I say attractive, attractive again. There was a time when military rule was completely discredited. Now, you do not want to try military rule. It has negative consequences. But the idea that coups can be good has come back. And I think the conversation has to center on what has happened to the democracy project in Africa since the early 1990s. And I think the Afrobarometer data is always telling us that Africans still want to prefer to live under democratic government. But there are concerns from respondents about the ability of democracy to deliver on the economic dividend front. And I think that's been the challenge there, democracy not delivering those kinds of goods. That's what's begun to reopen the door for soldiers to come back. The idea of a coup being some kind of silver bullet to whether it's ousting dictatorial or corrupt regimes. I think that's what's opened up that possibility. And I think that the longer democracies aren't delivering on the kinds of goods I just referred to, I think the more this idea will have traction. But a lot also, I think, here will depend on, particularly in that Sahel region, uh, just how well these military governments ultimately perform. So far, the evidence isn't very supportive of that. Insecurity is on the rise when a lot of these coup makers came to power claiming they were coming to resolve insecurity. Corruption is still the norm in some of these contexts. Democracy hasn't improved. And if we're to come to Zimbabwe, which is the main focus of the book, um, you've seen repressive legislations like the Private Voluntary Organizations Law come into effect in 2025, which has further closed down democratic space in this context. The first election after the coup, so the coup happens in November 2017, first election after the coup is June 2018. Opposition supporters go onto the streets to protest what they think is a very slow vote count. So they think a rigging is at play. The military is deployed and shoots down civilians. Some die in the streets of the capital city, Harare. So there's been massive repression as well, arrest of journalists, and talk today continually that the president, who was brought to power by the coup, Emerson Mnangagwa, is seeking to extend his time in power beyond the two terms. this constant speculation and division about that. So even there, not looking like a good coup went down. I work on Zimbabwean law. It's remarkable to hear Zimbabweans today begin to say things such as, um, maybe Zimbabwe wasn't as bad as we thought it was under the old man, i.e. Robert Mugabe. Which is a quite jarring assertion to make, given the lack of democracy and the economic downturn we saw under Mugabe. But these are the effects of coups. So I would say the idea of a good coup, to me, there are some cases, but not enough for me to be supportive of it. I
Yeah,
hope
thank
that
you.
answers
It is a no, but it's a difficult question. I think you gave an exhaustive answer to it, or as far as you can go with it. I think it's interesting also how you explained how individuals were part of planning to make sure that the AU did not react against the coup, or well, SADC, there were internal problems. But I think this is the case all the time, right? There's always individual interests that are playing behind the scenes. And for the Sahel wave of coup, we know that in Niger, there was also a division between ECOWAS and the way that the AU responded. So ECOWAS gave a 1-week ultimatum, and the AU took a different turn, even though ECOWAS is the closest regional organization. And there, the ECOWAS states were isolated within the AU, because the AU gave 2 weeks of waiting time before they wanted to reinstall the constitution. And in the end, nothing happened, right? So neither the AU nor the ECOWAS managed to change the coup or reinstall constitutional order. And in many ways, international actors are often looking at the African actors to see what type, where are we going? Where should we try to align with? I don't know the Zimbabwe coup, but you explained how they try to look at what are the regional actors doing, what is the AU doing, and after that we can take a stance. So it becomes very problematic when the AU is not making a clear statement. Like you said, it became like an endorsement. Even if you had Alpha Conde speaking out, it still was not a clear enough message that the AU did not accept it, or didn't accept it as a coup. So I think that's really interesting. But you also touch upon then this idea that today we're again, and I've also written about this, that I think that we're today in another type of era where coups are permitted in some way. We don't see the very strong punishment from different international actors. And I looked a bit in the history of coups, and we could see that in 1966, in the midst of the Cold War, there were 7 successful coups in Africa, which was the highest up until today, which was also in a similar context as today, when we have a global power competition, and where interests between the great powers are more about their own security interests than promoting values and norms. So maybe if you could speak a little bit about that. And we have also a question here about from Eduardo Castelbranco, about if you could maybe zoom in on the coup itself in Zimbabwe and look at the role of economic interest behind the coup, minerals or agriculture, and what changed after the coup in those perspectives, or from that perspective. And maybe also well, this is a bit outside of it, but we can discuss maybe Traoré in Burkina Faso, how he has become so popular. But I would say that this is not the case of a good coup. It's more of a case of a very good branding. But that's another question. And if there is somebody else who has a question, just raise your hand. You can find the hand in or reactions under all of the the gallery of speakers. But I'll let you start with these questions, Miles, and then we'll come back again.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree on your point about divisions, how coup makers are able to divide or undermine response. And I think they're very calculating in that way. Coups now, I think more so than olden day coups, you think a lot more about what international responses are likely to be, and you plan for that. And I just wanted to just add something else to what I said before. Was I talked a bit at the beginning when I was introducing the book about how gender is really important to all of this. And that's why I want to bring this up so it doesn't get lost. One of the ways that the generals are actively lobbying African regional actors and the diplomats was deeply gendered in the respect that they portrayed Robert Mugabe as lining up his wife, Grace Mugabe, to succeed him. In other instances, that actually Mugabe had completely lost control, was being manipulated by his wife to take over the presidency. Now, if you're selling that kind of message of a weak man, right, that is to delegitimize someone amongst patriarchal, deeply patriarchal politics in Africa. That didn't sit well with many heads of state who could not countenance the idea that this first lady was running roughshod over Mugabe and attempting to single-handedly determine the direction of the country. So this message was consistently sold. This is what we're trying to. So you remember when they announced a coup, they say we're not targeting Mugabe, we're targeting criminals around him, criminals around the president, and one of the criminals was presented in this messaging as the first lady. So this idea of this unruly woman who was talking out of turn, not knowing her place in the patriarchal politics, attempting to take over in this way by manipulating her husband, was sold to. That was struck to. It was by an interview with the former intelligence minister of South Africa, Bongani Wongo, him saying the generals were very good at passing on intelligence to us about what was happening. And I asked him, what were the things they would tell you? And this was the first thing he brought up, that Mugabe was no longer in charge, it was his wife, and they'd been forced to do this. And in that context of a lot of where patriarchal politics matters, that was quite persuasive. So I think that's kind of it's trying to bring back the genderedness of all this. I think that's important. And this idea of portraying a president who should be a commander in chief, who should be a strong man, right, as weak, now run by his wife, did not sit well with leaders who best understand politics as deeply masculinized. So that's the gender element to it. But coming back to more specific to your questions, there's a question here about the ZIMCO itself. Well, in the book, I point out, and again, this is relying on interviews with the generals themselves. Um, the coup did not have anything to do with economic matters. I think the motivations I picked up from the coup makers directly largely support what we find in the academic literature. I think it's now seeing Stefan Viking and a number of others, and I think Samuel Fine also makes this point that if we're to best understand the motives for a coup, we really need to take seriously the intra-military politics. That the militaries will say all these grand things about we want to fix the economy, we want to improve democracy, we want to improve. No. That's more how they justify the coup. The reasons they do it is often more what's going on in the barracks, who wasn't promoted, who got demoted, or who didn't get enough weapons, didn't get adequate training, or pay not arriving on time, or broken relations with the civilian authority. So what I found in the Zim context is actually it had a lot to do with that. So the generals were very concerned about losing their jobs. Mugabe was on the verge of retiring, many of the key ones. They were also insecure because some of them had a number of past crimes. So thought prosecution may be on the way. So this is a generalized sense of insecurity. Also, these generals in 2017, a lot of them were very young guerrillas in the 1970s liberation war in Zimbabwe. And this idea of Grace Mugabe that was being sold as Grace potentially taking over. Grace did not participate in the war, and individuals associated with her did not go to the war. That somehow Mugabe was now planning to abandon the liberation struggle generation and hand over power to individuals who had no connection with the struggle, whether in practice or its ideological beliefs. So that bothered them as well. And then the other thing I should say, this is Samuel DiCallo's point. Samuel DiCallo, I think Boubacar Diaye have always sort of remind us, yeah, you can get all these structural things, reasons for coups, but never leave out personality, individual motivations. There were some politically ambitious generals, I must say, who saw this idea of retirement, we were going to be retired, as also really a death knell for the possibility of them ever having successful political careers. And one of them is Constantino Chiwenga, who's the vice president of Zimbabwe today, was ambitious politically. So those are the reasons, I would say. A lot of intra-military reasons. And this point about personality, that's why it happened. And less to do with economic interests and the sort. Afterward, I would say what's really taken root around the economy itself, there hasn't been the uptick that was expected, because the expectation was from the West, particularly, which was key here, deliver on a set of reforms, a decent election, clean up the corruption, right? And then we begin to come in a major way to support you, whether it's budgetary support, FDI, and the sort. So because the coup-born government never delivered on these other promises that they pledged initially, there's been no real money coming into Zimbabwe that would uplift the economy again. So the economic struggles continue. Corruption has deepened, largely around the coup makers, those who were responsible for the coup, reaping great economic dividend, right? While much of the economy has continued to struggle. Hence, what I brought up at the end of my presentation, or was it one of the answers before, when I said it's remarkable now how you casually hear citizens say, maybe life under Mugabe wasn't as bad. Maybe the old man wasn't so terrible. It's precisely that. So the other thing, question concerned, I think, Traore and the good coup. Um, like I would have to concur with Nina here. I think there is a lot of very effective PR around Traore. That he's been effective at propagating, particularly outside Burkina Faso itself. I think if the ordinary Burkinabe who are keenly aware of how the security situation has worsened, how there's been no economic turnaround, how freedoms, democracy seem more even remote than they were before he took over. Um, that messaging doesn't resonate that much. But beyond, for those of us out here who are not on the ground, who don't experience these types of conditions, right? It does appear that he's doing remarkable things, standing up to the West. You know, the stuff comes up on my social media feed all the time. He's built a hospital there. He's built a massive road there in a short space of time to seemingly have made these major developmental strides, much of which is not true at all. It's fake news, it's propaganda. So I think he's been very effective at that. But I think what also part I should say, while I'm able to see through that, what's less easy to see through, or which might have some resonance, is his play on the legacy of Thomas Sankara. Sankara, since he died in the 80s, was assassinated by, it was Blaise Compaoré in the coup that removed him from power, has occupied this certain, how would I put it, how would I put it, position in broader African popular imagination. This young leader who was potentially transformative, coming back to gender, who actually valued women's rights, right? Who wanted to clamp down on corruption, who, when he died, had very little money in his bank account, and I think owned just a bicycle, so wasn't corrupt, young, had all these grand ambitions, leftist ambitions, but those possibilities cut short by this assassination and coup. So he's had this reverence and almost Che Guevara-like status on the continent. And I think Traore has played on that quite effectively. And for Africans familiar with the Sankara story, and here comes this Traore individual playing onto those tropes of Sankara, trying to present himself as a modern day Sankara. I think that swayed a lot of people. But on the ground, I think the facts tell quite a different story.
I think I
Um,
would agree with you on that one. I think that there have been quite a lot of AI affected news. There have been messaging that Traore has met with Beyonce and has met with different personalities in the West who have embraced his governance. And as you said, he's been seen as somebody who has been able to change the development of the country. But in reality, more than half of the territory is under jihadist control, and there is a very big and very forceful oppression of anyone who is challenging his rule. But I think it's also like you said, he's on the one hand he's surfing a bit on the Thomas Sankara image. He remains a captain, in contrary to the other ones who have auto-promoted themselves to generals in Mali and Niger, to the highest position possible. So he's perceived as humble in that way, that he's not going up the ranks. And then he also has his image. He's a very good-looking 34-year-old captain, and he has started to wear white gloves, which is also a way to personalize your power, to always wear the same clothes because people will remember you. And then if you combine that with a very good strategic communication outside or Burkina, I think that explains part of it. But I wanted to come back to Zimbabwe before we will end this very interesting book presentation, and what you said before about how gender and how women's involvement in politics plays a role in coups, and not just coups, of course, but the way that politics are developing, not just on the African continent, but for more broadly. And you showed how important it was in Zimbabwe that the president was not seen as weak, or that he was seen as not just following his wife's decision. And I think we're seeing a sort of, we had this period where women, peace and security, gender equality, they were also at the same time as the anti-coup norms. These were values that were promoted and pushed through, especially by Western actors, but also civil society, of course, in Africa, in other places. And now we see this backlash against women's rights, about gender equality, and we see it on the global stage. And I maybe to end with this, maybe your reflection on that, if you could maybe pull it out a little bit further than Zimbabwe, and talk about this, how that idea of the powerful man and as in power, how that has really come back on the international scene. And I'm now, of course, thinking about Trump and Putin and so on, but maybe reflect, and you can bring it back down to Zimbabwe however you would like to, but maybe reflect a bit on an ending note on the gender in politics.
Yeah, it was just before I come there very quickly. There's that book that came out, I think it was late last year, by Samuel Fury Childs Daly, Soldier's Paradise. And he's writing about the coups in Nigeria, and it makes a big point, the old coups in Nigeria. It makes a big point about how militarism in that context, it was also this. The aesthetic was very important. So precisely what you're saying, Nina. Good looking. They were good looking young men, fit. They looked dashing in those uniforms. And Traore does that. And he's saying there was something handsome and appealing about just that aesthetic, that just drew people. And I think Traore does that so well. And again, it's also playing on Sankara. Sankara was a good-looking young man as well. So I think it's that too. I mean, there's something quite appealing about that dashing, um, um, ambitious leader, young in uniform. I don't know what it is, but it seems to have an effect. But coming back to your question, which is very important, I think it's a challenging moment for the norms you're referring, just not just the Anti-Coup norms. Themes such as gender equality, democracy itself. There is a big pushback by the right. And you see this context of Africa itself. and context of the West, the examples you cited. One of my favorite ones in the Western context is the debate around whether Joe Biden should have tried to run for a second term. The New York Times ran a story front page where it pointed the finger at his wife, Jill, as the cause of that. So blame the woman she was scapegoated for. And I sat there, I was like, wait a minute, but he has a host of advices, whole inner circle, right? How does it just become Jill's fault? And I think there's a book that's just come out about that, about how it was all covered up by Tapper. I'm yet to read it. But so you see that, so it is that moment of backlash. One has to really take on board. And I think the key thing for anybody, whether it's scholars or activists or politicians who believe in these ideals, is to push back. This is not a moment to cower. So whether for us, if it's, as scholars, to start saying, maybe I'm not going to do too much gender analysis in my work anymore, or play out the significance of gender and women's politics and these things, because maybe not might not play well with my colleagues who now think this is a very niche thing that probably shouldn't be made so central to the study of politics, for example. I think we have to push back, assert continually. If we stop asserting, pushing back, showing its relevance, showing its importance, organizing, solidarity, finding like-minded others, these ideals will wilt away. Much of that ground, that progress that was made before, will be lost, and it'll be very difficult to recover it. So I think it's a moment to push back as well, organize, stay engaged. If you analytically in your work, these are the things that shape your thinking. That's certainly my case. I am not abandoning that at all. Now, whatever criticism will stick, I may get for it. I know one of the things that's been said, people who've reviewed my book in Zimbabwe, he think, a decent book, but perhaps Miles overemphasized the gender element. And that sense of overemphasis, to me, it's already a tick where that's coming from. Because the study of coups from time immemorial has been about masculinity, it's men, right? We've never thought about these men in gendered ways, or considered the role of women's politics in coup situations. And here you write a book about that, one of the very few that tries to do that, and is called overemphasis. So right, that's that pushback. So I think it's important to continue to assert it. That's how I would put it. It's not a moment to give up hope. It's a time to organize. Those of us who, your work, think this is intellectually productive, to keep demonstrating that. That's how we keep it.
Thank you, Miles. I think that's an excellent ending to a brilliant book presentation, that we shouldn't cave in for values that we want to promote, not just in our countries, but abroad as well, and values that we've worked quite hard to achieve in a certain way. And I think that we have gone out way beyond your book. In this discussion, we've discussed the dynamics of coups. We have tried to compare coups across Africa. We talked about how there are different eras where coups are more or less accepted and tolerated by both African and international actors. And we've come to the argument that today we are in an EU era where anti-coup norms are not voiced publicly, which is of course a worrying development for democracy more broadly. And we've also touched upon the importance of discussing gender relations when we discuss what's happening in politics, not of course just when there is coups, but beyond. And we've seen that that's also applicable to global politics more broadly. And I have one of our listener has, or one of our persons in the audience has also put the point out there that the coups might not be justified so much about what's coming after, but about the bad governance that was before. And I think that's also something that is worth reflecting on, that we need to, the coups are justified by something that was previously, and not really about the promises that are made in, which, as you have also shown, rarely are coming true, of what's coming after the coup, but it's really about the situation before. So I would like to thank you so much, and I also like to thank the people who listened in and tuned into this seminar. And you can see the link for the book is in the chat box, and if you didn't see that, then you can also find it on internet. And Miles, thank you so much for taking part of this.
No, thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about all this, and to the audience for the wonderful questions. It's been great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.